Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to CERN. Welcome to the Globe for Science and Innovation. Tomorrow is the day of the always and now much eagerly awaited TEDx CERN. It'll be the 5th edition, and for the first time, we'll be holding it outside CERN. We're going into central Geneva, into the beautiful setting of the Bâtiment des Forces Motrices. That's tomorrow. Today we are here for a more intimate event with a few of the carefully selected speakers that will be with us tomorrow to share an afternoon of events worth sharing, ideas worth sharing. We're delighted to see so many of you here, and we feel privileged and honored to have so many guests and speakers who are leaders in their field. We hope you enjoy the session, and please feel free, don't feel shy to ask questions. There'll be quite a large opportunity to ask questions. We'll have very short introductions from each of the speakers, and then we will open for questions. So you can ask questions directly using the microphones that are in the room, or you can use Slido. So for those of us who are following online through the webcast, please do use Slido to put your questions. So you just need to go to www.sli.do, so sli.do, or use the app, and then use the hashtag CERN event to be able to log into this event and make your questions. TEDx CERN is a CERN outreach event and part of the CERN in Society program. CERN in Society activities and projects are only possible due to the very generous and very valuable contribution of our partners and support from our partners, in particular Rolex and its long-standing association with CERN. I will now leave you in the very capable hands of our media partner, Lita, and moderating the first panel will be journalist Catherine Framery. Merci, Catherine.
Thank you, Anna. Hello. Yes, it works. Thank you, Anna, and especially thank you to everyone sitting in this beautiful CERN setting in this globe. And thank you for joining the conversation. I'm Catherine. I'm a journalist with newspaper Le Temps, Swiss newspaper in French, written in Swiss French. And I'm very happy to introduce you this afternoon to some of the fine people, fine thinkers of tomorrow who are going to attend tomorrow TED edition in Center Geneva. And we are gathered this afternoon to speak on trust and rights in the digital age. Please join me in welcoming to this roundtable Mr. Sinan Niral from MIT, Mr. Hans Bloch, and Moritz Riesewick, who are German filmmakers. They are going to tell us about the cleaners, and Mrs. Shermin Woschengir, who is coming from the University of Vienna. And so we are together for 1 hour. So at first we'll have a small conversation, exchanging views on the digital age and the threats it raises for our democracy. And after that, everybody will be able to ask questions from the webcast and from the audience. I suggest that we start with you, because you are my neighbor. Perfect. And so you are at MIT, you are professor of IT and management, and that's only one of your many titles. Many people heard of one of your latest studies, which made the cover of Science a few months ago, back in March, about how fake news spread on the internet. And it was, you are going to tell us about the conclusions you could draw from this study, because it was quite threatening and astonishing at the same time. And your next book will be focusing also on social medias. And I would like to share with you the subtitle of this book, which is going to be named The Hype Machine. And the subtitle, it speaks for itself, really. I mean, it's called The Madness of Crowds in the New Social Age. So it speaks for itself, yes. Can you please let us know a bit about what brought you to study these topics, these issues of digital threats in our world today?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you to all of you for coming. I'm looking forward to the discussion part. Let me just describe a little bit for you who I am, so you know where my perspective comes from. I am a professor at MIT at the Sloan School of Management and the Data Science Institute called the Institute for Data Systems and Society. There I am an applied econometrician focusing on network data and specifically causal inference in network data. So I study very large data sets of hundreds of millions of people interacting on Facebook and Twitter and WeChat and so on to understand how things, what are the cause and effect of the outcomes that we see as a result of these interactions. We run very large experiments, similar to experiments of the scale run here at CERN, but not with particles, but with people. Our experiments have tens of millions and sometimes hundreds of millions of people in them. And we're trying to understand things like social influence and the spread of false news and what the consequences of these information cascades might be in society. And I'm also an entrepreneur, so I've built and sold several companies in this space. And so I have a bit of understanding of the commercial applications of this kind of technology as well. Speaking of the study that we published on the cover of Science in March, we studied all of the verified true and false news that ever spread on Twitter from 2006 to 2017, verified by 6 independent fact-checking organizations. And we wanted to understand how truth and falsity diffuse differently on Twitter. And what we found was that false news diffuses further, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information that we studied, sometimes by an order of magnitude. False political news was the fastest traveling category of false news. And we also looked into a little bit why this type of news was traveling farther and faster. And how we might think about what we can do about it. So let me just stop there for the interest of time and discussion, and I will pass it along.
About fake news, there are some people that are always behind the stage that we never see. But in your documentary, Hans and Moritz, can you speak, can you tell maybe, your documentary was shown here at CERN a few months ago. It's called The Cleaners. It's been shown in many film festivals. It's also been broadcast on Arte. And so maybe many people among you have seen it already. And there are this kind of people, content moderators that you met in Manila, in the Philippines, and your documentary put into evidence that, in fact, the privacy, the security of the net is in balance with liberties. I mean, there is this dichotomy between freedom and security. Can you maybe sum up what you found out by shooting your documentary for the audience? Yeah.
Maybe first I describe the background, because we have a specific background, because we met each other in theater school. We studied theater directing in Berlin. And after a while we decided to make theater plays based on research, not Shakespeare, Chekhov and all that stuff. And after a while we came across with the term commercial content moderation, which means that there are people reviewing all kinds of content which is uploaded on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And they have to check and decide whether the content stays on the platform or disappears. And that was interesting on several levels for us, because on the one hand we imagined that it's very hard to do a job like this, because they are confronted with all cruel material which is uploaded on Facebook. That was interesting for us. How can a human handle that kind of job? And the other level was of course that this is a very important position, because they're deciding about what is published online and what is not. And that was interesting, and no one knew about those people. Maybe you can describe how we came across with that topic.
Yeah, and we tried to research on these workers, and we were surprised how secretive the industry actually is, because these content moderators are not hired by Facebook, YouTube, Twitter themselves, but by outsourcing companies in the Philippines and elsewhere. Philippines is the biggest destination worldwide. And these companies there, they do everything they can to hide this work. So they use code words. For example, in the case of Facebook, employees are only supposed to state that they work for the Honey Badger project instead of confirming that they work for Facebook. Why so? This made us curious, of course. They all have to sign non-disclosure agreements. They are not allowed to talk to journalists. In case they do, they are fired directly, and they face huge fines. So it was quite difficult to make a documentary film about this topic, and it took us quite a while. In the end, it was, I think, 3 years in total to make this film, because we needed to find a way how we could make this documentary without causing risk to the workers, to the employees. And eventually we found a way, and I don't want to spoil how. But yeah, what was really interesting for us was, why do they hide this work? Because actually you could think none of us wants to see pornography of this kind. None of us wants to see beheadings, for example. So there is such a huge number of materials online which definitely should be moderated, right? And shouldn't become visible on social media. But still, there is a huge part of material which is quite ambivalent, and where it's not that clear anymore if we should see that or if we shouldn't. And this number of content even increased while researching. We understood how complex the decisions are. And so what was a discovery, this is maybe the last sentence for now, is these people there, they are not journalists. They are not qualified in years. They get a 3 to 5 days training in the Philippines to do this job, and they have a few seconds to decide about each of these pieces. And so in a lot of cases, they told us they just apply their gut feelings, literally. And this is considering how important a lot of this content is for political conflicts, and how much impact it can have on our today's societies, which all of us know in the meantime. This is just scandalous. This is not at all appropriate.
Outsourcing democracy, outsourcing security of the web. Shermin, Voshegmir, you share something with Moritz and Hans. It's that you also studied movie direction and in Madrid, but you've got so many titles, it's difficult to sum up your CV, would I say. You now teach at the Vienna University of Economics. Can you maybe share with us what brought you to study, social issues on the web and social rights? You speak about digital human rights. Mm-hmm. Is there such a thing? That's a question you raise. Yeah. Can you explain to us what brought you to the issue?
Yeah. So first of all, maybe a little bit of background to me. Yes, if you research my CV, I've been all over the place, but I actually started studying information management systems and then went to the arts, and then somehow got back to the internet, especially when I stumbled over blockchain, which was 3 years ago, and I very quickly understood that this could be an operating system for a new kind of how society could organize itself, and it could be a novel way to resolve a lot of issues that we have today, but only if we do it right. And I started the Blockchain Hub in Berlin, and since beginning of this year, I'm actually not teaching. We're a research institute at the Vienna University of Economics. When we do interdisciplinary research, we're a research lab with 30 researchers from 6 different disciplines, lawyers, economists, business people, all different types of disciplines, and information systems experts. So why blockchain? You'll hear more about it probably tomorrow, but it changes the back end of the internet. And the internet brought us a lot of really, really good things, but it's also fundamentally flawed. We don't own our data. We have no control over what happens with our data once we start using internet services. This is based on how the internet is built. We have no settlement layer on the internet of where it's hard to get rewarded for transactions, for social media interactions. And this is why we have these weird business models that take our private data. We don't pay for the services, but the companies providing these services obviously need to pay their employees, and they sell our private data. So blockchain introduces this token layer with which we can have peer-to-peer payments, and we could introduce maybe also a layer of not only getting paid for our interactions on the internet, which we can't today, but we also build a reputation system for example, social media networks, because now we don't have reputation systems. So when we created the internet, it revolutionized information. It made it really, really cheap to disseminate information, and everybody became a journalist, especially when the Web 2 came and brought us social media. But we had this discussion today. When everybody became a journalist, we got rid of the role of the editor. And the editor and a news outlet had the function, or has the function, of quality assurance. Is the information that my journalist is writing, is that really true? Are the sources verified, et cetera, et cetera? And we didn't resolve that problem in the web. Blockchain can introduce us novel ways of having reputation systems, incentivizing people with tokens for doing the right thing. And this is why I think, among others, it could be a very interesting solution to some of the problems that we have in social media. And I'm just addressing social media issues. And maybe on the other hand, and then I'll wrap this up, because you addressed privacy in the machine age. One of the flaws of the internet is it never came with the privacy layer. The internet is built on a very tiny protocol called the IP protocol that basically just lets two computers communicate with each other, and it was invented here, so I probably don't have to, to explain it. It simply allows you to, well, the web was invented here, not the IP protocol. The internet allows you to send data packages from one computer to the other. And it's a simple communication protocol, and it never came with a security layer inbuilt. We built security on top. We have the chance now with blockchain. Cryptography is the integral part of that technology. And I think when we talk about the machine economy and the digital economy, everything we do today leaves a digital trace. Instead of talking about the right to be forgotten, we should talk about digital human rights and what cryptography means in that context.
So we could say that the four of you, sorry, share a same negative view of what the internet has become today, because you speak about false news spreading much faster than accurate news. You speak about democracy being outsourced to people who have nothing, no education, no training, and who are not really. We did not choose to select for us what we are entitled to see or not. And because, as you said, Shermin, our data has been stolen to companies and we don't own them, and it's very difficult to know what these companies know about us. So it seems that the internet has been broken. What I don't understand is that social networks, which brought all this series of misfortunes, have been existing for more than 10 years. How comes that the realization came so late? Does it mean that at the beginning it was still sound? Or is it because the system got faster and faster and we could not withhold anything anymore? Sinan, what's your view? You've been studying the effects on societies for 15 years.
Well, I mean, I think that I would correct a little bit your characterization. I don't think that I'm necessarily a pessimist about these technologies, nor do I think that I'm an optimist either. I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that there are tremendous dangers that exist in the systems that we have built, but I also think that there is tremendous potential for positive social change, for the dissemination of information, the extension of liberties, the mobilization of positive social movements, and it's all in how we use technology. Technology is essentially agnostic in the sense that it could be used for good and evil. And the key challenge of our current and future digital age is how do we harness this technology for good while avoiding the perils that it can create. And I think that this is a topic that is far-reaching across many different dimensions. In answering your question specifically, I think that one of the things that makes this technology different is that although humans have organized themselves into social networks since the beginning of humanity, the difference now is that digital social media or social technologies combined with machine intelligence accelerates the spread of information of various kinds beyond what we are currently capable of dealing with. In other words, the information spreads and human opinions, behaviors, and decisions are changed before there is really an opportunity to realize and figure out what is going on in order to make sound policy, corporate, and individual decisions about how to deal with this massive diffusion of information. But I think that there's a lot of hope in terms of different types of solutions that can be built into the systems that we already have that can curtail some of the negative consequences and accentuate and extend some of the positive potential of this technology. So in the end, I would consider myself optimistic and cautiously optimistic because there are certainly dangers.
Mm-hmm. Sherman, so you told us that blockchain could be a solution to fix some of the problems. Hans and Maurice, since you've shot your documentary, do you think there has been a consciousness growing in the public opinion that something should change, or do you think that we see more and more problems emerging every day? I don't know whether some of you read what BBC worked on last week about what's going on with fake news in India and in Nigeria, and it's so compelling. It's about the same conclusions that you have in your science study. Fake news, they spread faster and wider and deeper and further. People don't make any difference between if it's real or not. What counts, what is important is the novelty. If it raises, emotions, then people click and are interested in it. Do you think there are any changes that occurred since you did your movie, your film? Maybe people are more aware of what's going on?
Hopefully. I think there was a combination of different newspaper outlets and some press breaks, and maybe also our film, I hope. So the pressure on companies like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter definitely grew, and we can already see some of the effects, like just recently, Zuckerberg stated that he now proposes with his team a so-called Supreme Court for Facebook, and he invented like a rule book. He called it a blueprint for, I think, content regulation and policy making worldwide, which is interesting because he still believes that he and his team can fix all of it. And this is maybe symptomatic for the whole problem, because I think we have heaps too long accepted this role for a private company. There are only a few companies worldwide with this power to share huge amounts of the World Wide Web most of the people use daily. They are the gatekeepers, they have our data, they have heaps too much power, and we should get it back. And I think it's so interesting to be here at CERN, because CERN is the antidote in a way that innovation can't just come by private companies, it can also come by corporations, it can come by, as you say, like collaborations of people with similar interests. And this needs to be funded much more in order to get the power back from these companies. Because, like, when you saw, and then there is literacy about what the social media networks are. I mean, I don't know how many of you have seen the Congress hearings of Zuckerberg. They were actually a farce, and we watched them in total length, and it was really so interesting to see. It was entertaining in a way, because all of the politicians really seemed like clowns. They asked Zuckerberg literally how he and his friends make money. I mean, honestly,
Yeah.
is this a question which should be asked in a Congress hearing towards Facebook? I don't think so. They compare social networks with newspapers. No, these are not newspapers. It's a completely new infrastructure with its own mechanisms, its own logic of action, and therefore also its own dangers. And if we don't understand that, we won't be able to build something new which is so profoundly better than what we have now. So I think these are the layers, I would say, which we need to work on.
Just to add one thing, I think when we're talking about Myanmar or India, there's a new characteristic we are confronted with those social networks, and that's, I mean, we've been used to talking about viral posts for a long time. That's interesting because this term in cultural history always triggered fear and horror, and everything can spread so fast that any antidote comes too late. And that's interesting, and I think they are totally overwhelmed to handle that kind of content which is spreading around the world. And when we talked about people we are still in contact with in Myanmar or in the Philippines, nothing changed. So there's no significant change we can see. Also, the content moderators still working there. We are in contact with a few of these. And there was no change at all. There was no more qualification. There was no training, extra training. The salaries are the same. So at this point, we have to be pessimistic, I would say.
Charmaine, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, maybe I'm a skeptical optimist, right? When it comes to technology, I think technology is a very powerful tool. And I trust us that we can shape it, but sometimes we need time. First of all, I would like to disagree. 10 years is not a long time, right? You said 10 years is such a long time. No, 10 years is not a long time, because the first years, only the outliers of society were using Facebook. And since it became a mass phenomenon, only a few years have passed. And that's the first thing. I would like to put it into perspective. Maybe while I agree that social networks are a new phenomenon, they are a very novel way, but based on the idea of information dissemination, and before that it was newspapers. So how long did we have newspapers? We had that since the emergence of printing press for 400 years, and now we're saying 10 years is a long time. No, it isn't. And why did we have editors? They had a certain role, they had a function. And we got rid of the editor in social media. So we have to find distributed ways of having some types of meaningful reputation systems so we can know whether we trust information or we don't trust information. In that context, 10 years really isn't a long thing. And I do trust that new technologies, maybe this next generation internet, if we do it right, could bring us some problem. And the last thing is, we're talking about fake news like it's a completely new phenomenon. No, it's not. We used to call it propaganda.
Sure.
Yeah? And but propaganda in the information age works differently. So I think every time we have novel technologies that allow novel ways of organizing societies, it takes us a while to figure out what's new and what's not new. And if we would talk about propaganda, we would maybe much more easier be able to address this issue. But we call it something, we give it a new name, and we're like, oh my God, what are we supposed to do with this? And then we run around like beheaded chicken, and we're like super stressed out. And it's like, no, we know how propaganda worked. Like 80 years ago, you needed to control one outlet. Like there was one state monopoly, one television channel, and if you controlled this, and if you controlled the army, and if you controlled the state. Now it's harder, and we're still trying to make this study. 9/11 was pre-Facebook, And the Paris attacks were post-Facebook. And it's very interesting to see how long it took with 9/11 that people figured out, no, there are no bombs in Iraq, etc., etc. It took months, over a year, for people to figure out the fake news that were spread around the makers, like what was really, like who was behind 9/11, and it wasn't Iraq, etc., etc. With the Paris bombings, we already had Facebook. And you could see that a lot of the fake news that were spread around that were rectified much easier because we had a distributed system of information verification and checking. So when we talk about the real problem of fake news, and it is a problem, we should also talk about the things, the decentralization of information and the advantages it has brought us. Maybe let's not only focus on the problems. We should talk about the problems, but the internet has brought us many, many really, really good things.
Solution-based
Yes.
opinion, that's great. Maybe we can take a first question from the audience. If you want to ask a question from to someone specifically, please mention it during your questions. I don't know where the mic is. Okay, so maybe, I don't know who wants to start, if you've got, or maybe from the webcast, or maybe, in the front row, yeah.
I absolutely love what Sherman just said. That was really great. But I don't have a good question to it. I have a more trivial question back to the people who did who were talking to the people who were doing the censoring. I was wondering about the fact that they only have seconds to look at the pictures. Is this partly to protect them? Because is there any studies about what protects them from the trauma of seeing really horrible images?
No, it's not because of the traumatic effect. It's because of the amount of content which has to be reviewed. One of the moderators in our film told us he has to fulfill the credit of 25,000 images every day.
Oh my God.
So there's just, if you measure that, there's just a few seconds that left to decide about a content or a picture or a video. And but still, this work has a very strong traumatic effect to those workers. We work with psychologists in Berlin and also in Manila. Yeah, the effects are very different. Some of us told us that they are not able to eat anymore. They have a loss of libido, or they are one case in our film is about one person who was specifically trained for suicide videos or self-harm videos, and after he asked his team boss to be removed or transferred for this position, and they said no, he finally kills himself. So this is a very strong effect on those workers, and there's no proper psychological support at these companies at this point. Yeah.
And in terms of content which is not mainly disturbing but more ambivalent, it also makes sense not to give the content moderators too much time, because there is like a golden rule in the training which says don't overthink. And everybody has to learn this rule on one of the first days of the training, and we thought, why? That doesn't make sense at all. But the longer you think about it, the more contradictions you would discover, the more difficulties you would develop with moderating. It wouldn't, in the end, it wouldn't actually be possible to moderate most of the content. And so if they had to forward all of this content again and again and again, it wouldn't be profitable anymore. So it's actually calculated that they make some mistakes, I think. That is just a hypothesis. Because in most of the cases, people don't complain because they don't know enough about their rights.
Mark Zuckerberg is very proud to say that they are hiring 10,000 people to moderate more contents because they had problems. Do you have any idea of the profile of these new content moderators? Because it seems that now there are many of them in Europe, in westernized countries, and does it make a difference in the end?
I think it's not all about quantity. It's, as you said, about quality. And when Zuckerberg stated that he will hire 20,000 people at the end of this year, we don't know who are these people doing that kind of job. I mean, there is a new content moderation spot in Germany, in Essen. I think they hired like 1,000 people. And in Berlin is another one with around 1,000 people. But who are the 90,000 other content moderators working on that kind of field? And I think, as we discovered, the main spot is still Manila, and there are thousands of young people doing that kind of job, and they are not very qualified.
There is maybe an anecdote, because we were asking ourselves, is actually the German content, because we come from Germany, is the German content, or let's say the European content, only sent to the European centers, and is only the content from English-speaking countries sent to the Philippines? And this is obviously not the case. We were surprised to learn that, for example, when we went there, they had just had a crash course in identifying German Nazi symbols, because this was the time of the so-called refugee crisis, and there was a lot of Nazi content coming from Germany. And so they tried to teach them as quickly as possible that ovens and rats might be anti-Semitic, and they had to learn a list of slurs, German slurs, by heart in order to be able to moderate this kind of text-based content also. And of course, without any knowledge about the context and like the circumstances where this comes from, and imagine how difficult it is to distinguish, for example, satire from propaganda, or
context-based, I think moderation is very important, right? We personally know a few artists that got banned from Facebook a few times for using in their art that then they published online genitals in the context of art. And so I think value systems behind curation is a big question. So the question of the question is, do we really need manual, like centralized moderation? But if we do, the question is, do they share the same values? Because for a European, average European, they might not care about nudity, but they might care about Nazi symbols. Whereas it's exactly the opposite in the US. And we discussed this at lunch actually with Sinan today. It's like, what is truth? And who decides what truth is? And do we want a society where we allow multiple versions of truth? And then we don't have a technological discussion. We have an ethical discussion and we have a philosophical discussion. Do we want one centralized party, whether it's governmental or private, to decide what should be in my timeline? Do I want a person to decide or machine learning to decide? Actually, I don't want anyone to decide, if you ask me personally, because I want to have the freedom of choice. But that's my private opinion. For society, I think this is something we need to discuss, for sure. But it's a very long discussion.
It is. Thank you. Maybe we can take a question from the webcast.
Does fake news change how someone feels about an issue or merely reinforce a view they already hold?
Sinan, maybe?
So the research on, I agree that fake news is not a new thing. I think the first time the phrase fake news was used was back in the 1920s in a Harper's article. And obviously we've had propaganda for many, many years. But today, the research on the digital forms of fake news that we're talking about on this panel are very nascent. So we don't have that much understanding about the psychological effects or the conforming to prior beliefs or the confirmation bias that is involved in whether we agree with and then retweet or reshare information that turns out to be fake. So we need a lot more research. I think that a lot of the known human biases in information processing are present here. So certainly there is confirmation bias in the sense that if a piece of information agrees with what you think already, you're much more likely to believe it, you're much more likely to share it, even if it's not true or if it's fake. There is certainly the notion of the message source being important, so the credibility of the source, the location of the source in information space, and that's the distance of that, that location from your own position in the information space. In essence, those things are going to be personal. So message credibility, source credibility is contextual, it's relative, and so I think that a lot more research is needed to understand how fake news spreads and why, what are some of the psychologies behind the spread of fake news. Unfortunately, and I think it would be a shame not to make this point on this panel, we are really at a very critical moment in which direction we go with these questions. At present, we need a lot of, we need more information about how these processes operate, but the companies that hold all of the data and our access to a true understanding about how information spreads in the digital age are facing what I call a transparency paradox. So on one hand, we want them to open the kimono and show us exactly how the algorithms work and why do I see what I see and what kind of content moderation happens and why is this all clandestine and so on. But at the same time, we are also telling them, you need to close everything up and make it completely secure, and we shouldn't let any breaches of information, of people's private information happen, and you shouldn't be giving private information to research companies or to universities because these are the Cambridge Analytica scandals that are resulting from an opening up of the data. So I call this a transparency paradox because they need to thread this needle of being simultaneously open and secure at the same time, and this is not a very easy needle to thread, so we'll need to figure out solutions to this.
But just a question, and really an open question. Don't you think they would have been capable of identifying Cambridge Analytica as not a university project which is worth sharing the information with if they wanted?
Well, the problem is the business model. Sorry, right? With Cambridge Analytica, the problem was not the sharing for studying reasons. The problem was that Cambridge Analytica then, through the back door of other companies, used this data to pay Facebook for targeted advertisement.
Well, let me just sort of answer. There's a little bit of misconception in both of these answers, I think. So the data was given to Cambridge University, not to Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge University then gave it to Cambridge Analytica as part of a collaborative effort of research. Then Cambridge Analytica misused and so Cambridge University violated the terms of service of their agreement with Facebook, and then Cambridge Analytica violated the terms of service of Facebook as well. But would it have been possible for Facebook to know that Cambridge University shared the data with Cambridge Analytica? I think it would be very difficult. I think the way that you police that is through the agreement that you have with Cambridge University. But the sharing of that data with Cambridge University is the exact same kind of sharing that is done with research universities all over the world every day in order to better understand how Facebook affects society and affects elections and so on. Now, your question about the business model is absolutely essential. I do think that there are elements of the business model that have the potential and clearly the demonstrated empirical outcomes of perverse and negative outcomes for society. Do I believe that we should therefore change the Facebook business model to something completely different? Well, I think it depends on what that something completely different is. Those other things are also fraught with peril. So one of the typical suggestions is we should just make Facebook a paid service. Everybody pays, $10, $20 a month to be on Facebook, and there are no advertisements. But if we believe that Facebook and LinkedIn and all of these other services are an information resource that allow people to have job mobility, to have access to information, to be able to create new projects and new intellectual products that they can then profit from, pull themselves out of poverty with, or improve their agriculture, mobile agriculture or mobile health in the developing world, then now you have a problem of access to information inequality, because those who are rich can afford to pay to access that information, and those who are not cannot. So what do we think about the inequality that's created by some of the alternative business models? One of the benefits of the current business model is that it's free and equitable access to information across all social strata, okay? Assuming, of course, that you have sufficient access to have internet access and computer access and so on. And by the way, Facebook and Google and the rest are trying to, for their own business model's sake, trying to democratize access to information in general. But I think the context of the business model question, which I believe is an absolutely essential and fundamental question, is much more nuanced than people think at first blush. Yeah, it's not just do away with the advertising model because that's clearly the culprit here. I think there are ways to fix the problems within the current model, and I think that there are problems with alternative models, and I don't even know if I have an opinion about what the right path is yet. I'm currently in the mode of trying to understand the problem before coming to the table with a firm belief on what the solution is.
But there is
in Europe we have
GDPR.
But there is a blockchain solution to that, actually.
Yeah, I want to add something, maybe a third option, or that in Europe we have a very strong public broadcasting, and it's worth spending a lot of money to finance this public broadcasting, because back in times we believed that it really makes sense for these broadcasters not to depend on advertisement, not to depend on how many people watch this or that program, because it has such a meaning for the society. And I could imagine quite a similar model for social networking. If we believe that social networking is an infrastructure which serves the public, if it's designed in a specific way, and this design needs to be discussed publicly, democratically, then we could imagine quite a similar model. We don't need to only rely on these two options, on either advertisement or payment. This is not true that these are the only options.
Well, it's a big debate here in Switzerland about the role that the public media should play.
But in the context of blockchain, these things are changing. The data structures are changing from centralized, where companies own or sit on data behind, and data is locked behind gardens. And with blockchain, data is democratically available to everyone in the system, and everyone can now run big data. Yeah? That introduces new problems, privacy-related problems, but at least one company cannot bank on data, which means that if that technology, if we assume that blockchain and the Web3 will become a thing, we don't have to talk about these business models anymore because they're not relevant anymore, number one. But we will see, time will show, but we already have the first decentralized social networks like Steemit that have very different business models. And if we can have, and the question around, but I do fully agree that access to a social network is very, very important. Do I want to guarantee equal access rights? Permissionless access rights where you don't have a paywall, where certain people who are economically less off can't contribute. But as I said, the business models are changing, and we have new incentive systems through the token economy, and I think a lot of these problems that we're discussing now are already irrelevant with these new technologies. But the new technologies, yes, Steemit already has been operational since 3 years. It's a decentralized social network on a blockchain, It's been operational since 3 years. It has 1 million registered users, and these users get paid in Steemit tokens for each contribution that they make, and whether by posting something or by liking something or by disliking something. And I personally know people who can pay their rent just being active on Steemit. The future is already here. Most of us don't know it yet because it's like in the first 2 years of Facebook where only a minority of people were using Facebook and most people didn't have an idea yet. So we can already see it. If you're interested to find out how a blockchain-based social network could work, please go on steemit.com, register, use it, and I think you can get a glimpse of what the future could bring. The problem with these new technologies will introduce a whole new set of problems. They will resolve some of the old problems, but they might bring new problems. For example, on the Steemit blockchain, there is not one company owning the data. The data is transparent to everyone. On the Block Explorer, everyone can run big data. This is a privacy issue. Do I want everyone to be able to run big data on my activities on Steemit? The good news, we have cryptographic methods that we can use that allow us what you were discussing before, a few questions before. We have cryptographic methods that some alternative blockchains are already using called zero-knowledge proof cryptography, which allows us to have a level of transparency that allows us to have these cool applications while maintaining the privacy of individual actors. And I think if we do it right, we can have privacy in the digital age. But we really need to discuss this, and I feel that it's not being discussed yet enough. The role of cryptography, talking about GDPR, everybody keeps talking about the right to be forgotten. This is not a realistic thing. We need to talk about cryptography, and I really don't understand why it's not happening.
I'd just like to add briefly one more thought. Because when we now talk about, for example, social media, there's just one big social media company. It's Facebook, and we are forced to use Facebook. Otherwise, we can't stay in contact with our friends. And everything would change if this is more an infrastructure with different providers, so that we, as a user, can decide, I trust in this kind of company, and I have access to these infrastructures, and still are in contact with my friends, either they use Facebook or something else which exists. And we have to force those, maybe the politicians, that it's not possible that we don't have just one big company running the internet at the moment.
It's a monopolistic question once again.
This is exactly what Tim Berners-Lee is working on, by the way. This is called Solid, and this is a completely different model. And this is also an interesting idea, and maybe we should also just follow up on that in a few years and see where it went to. Because this has the idea, to make it short, that companies don't own our data, but that they can just have access to certain parts of our data if we want them to have. Mm-hmm. This is a really revolutionizing idea, I think. It gets back to the more original idea of the World Wide Web as he probably would have imagined it.
And about the monopoly of Facebook, it has really to be mentioned that young generations are less and less on Facebook. I mean, they use other social media.
Yeah, but they use Instagram, which is owned by Facebook.
Yes, but not only. I mean, it's changing. It's moving all the time. So I think maybe our generations, they use Facebook, but I'm not so sure about younger generations. Yeah, okay. Maybe we can take another question from the audience. Yes, merci. I love these guys.
No, thank you. The one question I have is, when data is no longer owned by a company, but really free accessible by everybody, is it imaginable to have data qualifiers? So any element of data would have some metadata being tagged as likely true, likely false, fake news, likely appropriate, likely inappropriate, according to different algorithms, because many people would be able to provide algorithms to decide.
Yeah, so yes, and I think that that's one of the sort of 5 basic roads or avenues, paths towards solutions to these problems that I can conceive of. If you think about when you go to buy food at the supermarket to consume, it's extensively labeled. You know how many calories it has, how many trans fats, and whether it's produced in a facility that produces wheat and peanuts if you have an allergy. But when it comes to information, we don't have these labels. But I think that the question that is difficult is not should there be labels, but how do you get to those labels? Yeah. The question really becomes who gets to decide what's true and what's false? Who gets to program an algorithm? What are the inherent biases that go into that algorithm? It's really a question of political philosophy or social philosophy rather than a technical question of labeling or automation. I think it's a combination of both of these things that needs to be thought about together in order to come to this kind of a solution.
Fake news is spreading 10 times faster than any true news. So there are different patterns how truth and fake news or data elements behave. Or you have a trustful source, you don't have a trustful source, so this could all be elements into a bigger
so
machine.
Certainly the reputation of the sources is important, but...
And the peer review.
Excuse me?
And the peer review process on data elements.
Peer review, okay. So let me I agree. Reputation is important. Peer review is important. But on Steemit, as I learned today, you can purchase reputation. Okay, you can buy it with money.
It's a
bad design. So on peer review, who gets to peer review? Who are the ones who have the authority to say this is fake or this is not? And when it comes to political discussion, where there are differences of opinion rather than differences of fact, how do you, and even fact itself, you know, what do you consider standards of evidence in terms of labeling something fake or not? Or when it comes to political argumentation, is it really even a question of fact versus fiction, or is it something a little bit more squishy? Then peer review and reputation are not silver bullets. In fact, there is no silver bullet. You cannot escape the political and social philosophical questions that underlie the problems that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Do you think social journalism is responsible for the lack of credibility within news agencies? So much competition may create a reduction in responsibility.
What kind of journalism?
Social journalism, so people posting blogs and news stories online that aren't accredited.
Sinan, that's also for you, I think.
You know, I think my initial reaction to that is that I am very happy to have decentralized journalism. I'm very happy to have decentralization of opinions, fact-finding, dissemination, and so on. But I think that we need to have a broader discussion about how we curate the information that's created by this. And I think that gets into peer review, reputation, blockchain, public funding, which, by the way, I think public funding, I think we also in the US have a lot less, but we do have publicly funded news organizations. I don't think that they come anywhere near the scale that would be needed to fund Facebook,
that's
for instance.
Really a difference.
It's a huge scale, right? I mean, the public funding is a drop in the bucket compared to what would be needed to support this network. So the answer is, I think, you know, I support and I'm very happy to see citizen journalism. But in the end, we're going to come back to all of these questions of peer review, moderation, curation, and underlying that, we're going to have a technical layer that we need to think about. But underlying that, we're going to have a conversation in society about the philosophical questions that are confronting us. We're not going to be able to dodge these questions with technology.
You mentioned auditions at the Congress, you know, with members who kept asking such, I wouldn't say silly questions, but I mean, they were not relevant. Don't you think that an education to the media should start maybe with politicians? I mean, with the heads of state, and there should be, you know, a web summit of heads of state or something, you know?
Yes, and in fact, we're working on that at MIT. We're organizing some moves in that direction, and I know they're doing the same thing downriver at Harvard. And I think that there's a lot more. I also watched these. I watched them 3 times all the way through. I even made popcorn, and it was very interesting and exciting. But it was also a little bit depressing. I agree with you to see the way that the conversation went, and that just the sheer ease with which the companies, not just Mark Zuckerberg, but other companies in prior hearings were able to just sort of deflect the questions and get around the questions. And I don't think that our politicians, our congressmen and women were prepared, in any way prepared, to really have an educated conversation with these companies at the level of, you know, blockchain or, you know, content moderation, peer review, tokenization, privacy, and so on.
But there's a fundamental problem to that, and while I think it's very important to educate policymakers to how the internet works, and I think a web summit for policymakers is a very good idea. The fundamental problem to that is I've been working with politicians for 3 years now trying to explain blockchain. You have a bunch of lawyers who don't understand technology, creating the laws of the digital century, you know, of the 21st century. And so there is a huge gap of what most policymakers, not all, understand, from politicians to bureaucrats, because they've mostly been trained to be lawyers. And that was the technology of the 18th century. Back then, the law was a new technology, you know, written law signed by hand. We've moved beyond that ever since the emergence of computers and especially the internet. But most politicians and policymakers don't even understand how the internet works. So when they ask this question, a friend of mine said, but that's for sure it's fake, they bribed him. And I'm like, no, unfortunately not, because I'm having the same discussions with like politicians in Germany and Austria. So, and it's 2018 in countries like Austria and Germany, and I believe it's the same in the US, we're not teaching young kids how to code on a general level. So the gap of what we're learning and what we need in this digital world, whether we're politicians or not, to understand what's happening, to be educated citizens, to not fall for fake news, and as politicians make right policy decisions, it's based on our education that's based on a completely different world pre-internet. And we need to tackle that if we want to tackle a lot of these problems we're discussing.
So more science, more technology, more code at school. Yeah.
It's 2018. Yeah. Why is not everybody in kindergarten learning how to write hello world like in a playful manner? Why not? Like, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, we had the same impression because we also screened our film not just at film festival but also at the European Parliament or UNESCO, or in November we will screen the film in the Bundestag, and we also spoke with a lot of politicians about the film. For example, Heiko Maas, which invented the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, NetzDG. And this was a law created for Facebook, that they have to delete hatred and hate speech within 24 hours. And I totally understand that he was looking for regulating Facebook for that, but at the end of the decision, he forces the content moderators in the Philippines to even decide faster about this content. And this is so...
It's because they don't know how the back end of the internet works.
They don't know the back end.
They don't know how the internet works, and if we don't know how the internet works, we can't regulate it. We can't contribute to a better internet.
A question here. please.
So I just want to make one comment and then one question. Both are actually mostly for Sherman. So the first one, you mentioned that the fake news existed already and that was called propaganda and so on. I think that in this world we actually face something completely else. I'm currently developing generative adversarial networks that can actually generate the images of anybody speaking any content. And this is currently 75% of cases fooled, the humans are fooled that these are real. So I think we are actually facing, technology is actually opening up new avenues in which we are really facing different problems that we ever did. I do believe that actually you can check various news because you can actually go through all possible and impossible flows of the information that you have in order to check, but this needs a lot of computational power currently. So that's like one part of the things. I want to ask you, given the blockchain, that's one of the things that I'm really interested in, can you actually use the blockchain to develop the queues or the kind of stamps for each and every datum that would have some personalized, fully, like biometric trait, you know? Like your face, your fingertip, your voice, whatever biometric is, or a combination of those, put it in a blockchain and then actually stamp each and every datum that is coming from you, and hence you know that only if you have the access to that blockchain, that's actually something which is you know, valid and true, and you can then share this with people with whom you want to share. Isn't that maybe a way to deal with this problem? What do you think?
Actually, when we're talking about Facebook not knowing what happened to the data, we have, I mean, the power of blockchain, it gives the full transparency of the provenance of goods and services, digital and analog. If it's analog services, it needs a combination of AI, IoT, and blockchain. But if it's a digital data trail, you can have full transparency of what happened to data. And we today have, for example, a look into what the Ocean Protocol is doing. They're trying to bring transparency to big data by using blockchain tokens. They need to work with companies, actually. And if you tag data and identify it on a blockchain, you can have a full transparency of what happened with your data. So they're trying to build a system where big data companies of the Web 2 that are currently monetizing this data can keep monetizing data, but they split the token with the people selling their data, at the same time giving individuals full control over what happened to their data. So in the future, things like the Cambridge University / Cambridge Analytica scandal can't happen anymore. So yes, provenance and transparency of what happened when can happen when and if blockchain-based technologies, and blockchain is a synonym for more technologies in this new decentralized web. If they're successful, we can bring more transparency to data, to this sea of data, ergo the name Ocean Protocol. So yeah.
Thank you. We can have another question from the webcast. Maybe it's going to be our last question today.
Does religious bias have any impact on censorship activities, for instance, in largely Catholic Philippines?
I think we can't answer that in general. I can just share some impressions we got, and that was that a lot of the content moderators we interviewed told us that for them it's not only a 9-to-5 job, but that it is actually kind of a mission, which is indeed highly influenced by their beliefs, by their religious beliefs. And yes, they are Catholics, most of them, and some told us that it makes total sense to them to sacrifice, in a way, to not be nailed to the cross, but to sacrifice their mental health in order to make the world get rid of the sins which spread across the web. And of course, this can become dangerous if the content moderators don't distinguish enough anymore between maybe challenging content, but content which is worth being seen, and on the other hand, really illegal content or content which shouldn't be published according to the majority of the people who use it. And so this thin line is not guaranteed anymore when people start believing that it's their religious mission to clean the web. And there is a saying in the Philippines which is written at walls in a lot of schools, and this is, cleanliness is next to godliness. So yeah, this narrative is quite strong in the Philippines, and maybe you want to add there's another narrative which adds perfectly, cynically spoken, with this religious mission, and this is the narrative of social cleansing, which is promoted by the president of the Philippines. And since he was elected, supposedly 20,000 people were killed in the streets, and he defends that. He says it's okay to clean up society. And there is one content moderator in our film who states that what Duterte does in the streets, he does for the web.
It's also shaping the web we can see. I mean, there is no diversity if all the cleaners are same background and same ethics. So it's very against any diversity in our societies. It's not, I don't know, Sinan, if you want to add maybe sort of a final word for today?
Yeah, I mean, the centralization of this cleaning is a bit scary for me, I have to say. One of the promises of the internet was the diversity of opinion and the diversity of information and thought that could be achieved. Hopefully we can find solutions that get us back to this kind of ideal. With any kind of endeavor, I think you're always going to have problems. So even the solutions that we're thinking about today, as you mentioned yourself, are going to have their own problems, which we are not aware of today. So this is going to be a constant struggle to achieve the promise and avoid the peril, and I think we have to stay vigilant in trying to do that. I don't think that the solution is to throw away the technologies or to in some sense, give up. I think the solution is to think about this not as finding what the one solution is, like a silver bullet. This is going to be a process of continuing to improve, finding new problems, solving those problems, finding new problems, solving those problems, and it's going to be a back and forth.
Thank you. Sherman, if you want to add something. So
I actually fully agree. Just one maybe last thing. It's not only centralized human kind of censorship. We use a lot of algorithms to filter and censor. And algorithms are also points of centralization. So I think whatever solution we come up with, to fully agree with what Sinan said, it needs to be distributed. It needs to allow for what we call minority rights.
Hans and Moritz, on this,
I think we also totally agree with what you said, and I hope events like this, TED events, will continue, that we discuss all these issues and have a critical view on all these things.
And I think this panel already shows how complex it is to find solutions, and I totally agree that we haven't found the solution yet, but I think what we did now in the last 1.5 hours is probably what we should do much more in public in future, and not behind closed doors in back rooms somewhere in Silicon Valley or at outsourcing destinations, or not even in closed rooms in some back rooms in the parliament. It should be public. And if we share the complexity of all these problems with the public, I think more and more people will involve themselves into the discussion, and that's exactly the thing we need, because democracy hasn't developed within 10 years. It was a long progress, and to find rules for the digital public sphere, which that will take longer, but we need to work on that all together and not just a few people.
Thank you so much to you four. Thank you everybody for joining us, and I hope you had the same pleasure I had in listening to these fine speakers. Thank you again, and we'll see everybody of you hopefully tomorrow, and maybe in half an hour there is another session. Sorry.
Yeah. Maybe I can.
Maybe you can introduce the next panel.
The next panel will start in a few minutes at 6:30. So thank you very much, Catherine, for the moderation. Thank you very much to our guests. Thank you for being here. If you don't have tickets for the second panel, we would ask you to just wait outside so that those who do have tickets come in, and then the remaining seats, you're very welcome to take the remaining seats. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.